Vladimir Putin's greatest fear has come true. It wasn't weapons that ran out, but money itself. The Kremlin's richest men themselves admitted that the Russian economy had collapsed uncontrollably.
A Russian billionaire has been defending himself at the High Court in London against accusations that he betrayed a business rival.
This was not just a crisis, it was the beginning of a domino effect that would bring down the Putin regime. Because for years, the Kremlin built a single myth with a massive propaganda machine. The myth of Russia, the impregnable fortress, was an economic structure immune to sanctions, capable of weathering any geopolitical storm, self-sufficient and unshakable. This narrative was Vladimir Putin's fundamental promise of stability to his people and the loyal elite who kept him in power. It was an implicit social contract based on the idea that the cost of war would not be borne by ordinary citizens, that order would never be shaken, and that prosperity would somehow continue. However, the first and most fatal crack in this massive propaganda wall was opened not by a missile from outside, but by a confession from the very heart of the system.
Я скажу, потому что это было уже в интернете, около 12 миллионов долларов.
It all began with that fateful statement by Alexander Shokhin, president of the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. Shokhin was no ordinary businessman. He is the official spokesperson for Russia's richest and most powerful companies, the oligarch class that built modern Russia, and is now witnessing its collapse. A figure who had previously served as deputy prime minister and minister of the economy, he knew the system inside out, and the words that came out of his mouth shattered the Kremlin's months-long soft landing fairy tale like a sledgehammer. Shokhin said the slowdown in the Russian economy had now become an uncontrolled contraction. This choice of words was not accidental. The word uncontrolled was a direct attack on the image of absolute control, unshakable stability, and predictability that Putin has built for over 20 years, because the financial empires of the people Shokhin represents were melting away before their eyes. The picture presented by the Kremlin was quite different. To see the vast gap between the Kremlin's official propaganda and the harsh reality on the ground, one must delve into the depths of the numbers. These numbers are like an autopsy report showing that a country's economic heartbeat has come to a standstill. At the beginning of the year, Russia's Ministry of Economic Development predicted that the economy would grow at a healthy rate of 2.5% despite the sanctions. This was a propaganda figure designed to convey the message that everything was fine despite the ongoing war. However, according to the latest data, this optimistic forecast has plummeted to 1.0%, amounting to a collapse. Even the Russian central bank had to admit that growth was sliding toward the lower end of its own forecast range of 1.0 to 2.0%, meaning actual stagnation. As Shokhin bitterly confirmed, any growth rate below 2% means that the economy is no longer experiencing a soft landing, but rather that the engines have stalled and it is losing altitude dangerously. However, the real disaster is unfolding in the balance sheets of companies, the lifeblood of the economy. Corporate profit forecasts for next year have been reduced by approximately 18%.
Некоторые другие нефтяные компании, как, например, компания «Югус», имеют сверхзапасы. Как она их получила?
According to data published by the Russian state statistics agency Rosstat for the first half of 2025 and later reported by the pro-Kremlin newspaper Izvestia, nearly a third of Russia's largest companies reported losses. Approximately 19,000 large companies reported total losses of more than 5 trillion rubles during this period. This is the highest loss rate seen since the darkest days of the pandemic. The reasons behind this collapse are no secret. On the contrary, it is the cumulative result of a series of factors that interact with each other to form a deadly cocktail. The first factor, as you might guess, is Western sanctions. Years of accumulated sanctions have slowly strangled the Russian economy's access to technology, financing, and global markets. Energy giants Gazprom and Rosneft have long been the financial foundation of the Russian state budget and the Putin regime. These two giants had built their entire business models around the European market. However, Putin's decision to invade Ukraine meant he was killing the goose that laid the golden eggs with his own hands. Western sanctions and Europe's rapid disengagement from Russian gas and oil wiped out Gazprom and Rosneft's most profitable market overnight. Discounted sales to China and India are far from compensating for this massive loss. Metal and mining giants such as Sevastol, Magnitogorsk Iron and Steel Works, and Rusal were symbols of Russia's industrial power. However, their success was largely dependent on selling high-value-added steel and aluminum to Western markets and, most importantly, importing the modern technology and machinery needed for production from the West. The sanctions closed both of these doors at the same time. State-controlled banking giants like VTB Bank and Sberbank are paying the price for being excluded from the SWIFT system and unable to conduct international dollar and euro transactions. They are no longer global players, but merely banks serving an isolated domestic market under sanctions. Even Yandex, the tech giant known as Russia's Google, has had to shelve its international expansion dreams and focus solely on the domestic market. Being close to the Kremlin is no longer a privilege, but a burden, because that proximity automatically puts you at the top of the West's sanctions lists. That Kremlin connection, which once opened the door to wealth, has now turned into a shackle that closes the doors of international markets, finance, and technology in their faces. Another factor is Putin's war machine. The trillions of rubles printed to fuel the war machine, combined with a shortage of goods and services in the market, fueled inflation. To curb this inflation, the central bank was forced to raise interest rates to a suffocating level of 21%. This move virtually strangled the civilian economy. It became impossible for companies to obtain credit, investing became suicidal, and consumption plummeted. This situation creates the most deadly economic spiral, which economists call stagflation. This spiral is a toxic combination of near-zero growth and double-digit inflation. This combination is the worst-case scenario for an economy and only the beginning of a nightmare for ordinary Russian citizens. This fire, which started in Moscow's financial centers and the luxury offices of oligarchs, is spreading to the remotest corners of the vast territory spanning 11 time zones. The crisis is brutally exposing the reality of a two-speed economy that divides Russia. On one side, there is a military-industrial complex, artificially inflated and sucking up all the country's resources like a black hole, into which the state pours trillions of rubles for the war. On the other side, there is a struggling civilian economy, robbed of its resources, its most talented workforce, and its capital to feed this war machine. The figures are proof of this parasitic growth, this economic cannibalism. In the first half of 2025, sectors directly linked to the military, such as the production of transport equipment, showed a massive growth of 34.6%. Civilian sectors that provide jobs for millions of people, such as food production, automotive, electrical equipment, and wood processing, have seriously contracted. In other words, the war economy is devouring the civilian economy alive. And this cannibalism has its most destructive effect in the regions. In the first half of 2025, 67 out of Russia's 89 regions reported serious budget deficits. Examples of this collapse are scattered across the country. For example, in an industrial center such as the Komi Republic in the Arctic region, known for its rich natural gas and coal deposits, income tax collection collapsed by 53.9% compared to the previous year. In Chelyabinsk Oblast, another industrial giant that forms an important part of the Russian war machine, from tank production to metallurgy, this decline was 33.3%. Although the war initially seemed to bring vitality to this city, the collapse of civilian industry and the diversion of all resources to military production have wiped out tax revenues in the long run. However, this bleeding is not limited to just a few industrial regions. The city of Toliati in the Samara Oblast, known as Russia's automotive capital and where Lada cars are produced, is on the brink of a full-blown social disaster. With the withdrawal of Western automotive giants and the halt in parts supply due to sanctions, the AvtoVAZ factory is either operating well below capacity or producing primitive cars lacking even the most basic safety features such as airbags and ABS. In the Far East, Primory Krai on the Pacific coast and its center Vladivostok once dreamed of being Russia's window to Asia. The region's economy relied on trade with Japan and South Korea, fishing and port services. The war and subsequent sanctions completely destroyed this trade. The port of Vladivostok has now become a hub not for commercial container ships, but for mysterious munitions ships from North Korea or military logistics operations. In the heart of Siberia, Krasnoyarsk Krai, home to giant metal companies such as Rusal and Norilsk Nickel, shares a similar fate. As these companies lose the high-profit markets of the West and are forced to sell their products to China at deep discounts, their profits are melting away. Melting profits mean melting taxes paid to the regional budget. The meaning of these abstract figures is very concrete and cruel for ordinary people. It means that regional administrations will no longer be able to pay the salaries of doctors, teachers, and firefighters, repair collapsing roads and bridges, heat schools and hospitals, and will have to suspend basic public services. The economic crisis is turning into a social catastrophe, a state collapse. Ordinary citizens are paying the heaviest price for this catastrophe. Due to rising borrowing costs and slowing wage increases, the artificial consumption frenzy of the early years of the war has ended. The growth rate of retail sales has slowed dramatically and has almost come to a standstill. Pension payments are well below even the official inflation rate, silently pushing millions of elderly people into poverty. The social contract built on Putin's famous promise of stability is being torn up before the eyes of millions of people. The promise of a secure and predictable life is now gone. All that remains is fear, helplessness, and a silent social anger ready to explode at any moment. This is not just an isolated economic crisis. This is the first domino to fall. This uncontrolled contraction, which began with Alexander Shokhin's historic confession, has triggered an unstoppable chain reaction that will lead to the collapse of the Putin regime. The oligarchs are in a panic. The 18% collapse in corporate profits is not just a statistic. It is a direct attack on the wealth of the elite class, whose loyalty to Putin is based entirely on money, power, and immunity. For them, this is not just a number on a balance sheet. It means the end of their mansions in London, their yachts in the Mediterranean, and their bank accounts in Switzerland. As their financial empires are crushed, their loyalty to the regime will also be shattered. Shokhin's statement is the first overt signal of this break. Oligarchs whose fortunes are melting away will now begin to see Putin not as a guarantee, but as the biggest obstacle to their survival, a burden. Behind closed doors, whispers about who the successor will be have already begun. In an environment where profits have vanished and interest rates are suffocating, companies will have no choice but to resort to mass layoffs and halt production. This situation will create a complete social catastrophe, especially in the mono-cities stretching from the Ural Mountains to Siberia, which are dependent on a single giant factory. When the factory closes in these cities, life stops. This means not only unemployment, but also despair and anger. Unemployment, skyrocketing prices for basic necessities such as food and medicine, and public services brought to a standstill by the collapse of regional budgets will push the population to breaking point. The inevitable result will be long queues at supermarkets and gas stations, strikes over unpaid wages, and widespread chaos that security forces will struggle to contain. Telegram channels, which the Kremlin cannot control, will instantly become centers of anger and organization against the regime. What Putin fears most is a leaderless popular movement that he cannot control. The security elite, the Siloviki, are not immune to this crisis. Their power, privileges, and massive budgets are also dependent on the health of the economy. As resources dwindle, the internal competition and power struggle between the FSB, the army, the National Guard, and other clans will turn into a knife fight. The fight to grab a share of the shrinking pie will fatally weaken the regime from within. They will begin to sabotage each other, to trip each other up. Putin's role as arbiter will become meaningless in this chaos. Finally, the war machine will be destroyed. This is a strategic checkmate. An economy in uncontrolled contraction cannot sustain a high-intensity industrial war. This is as certain as the laws of physics. The state will run out of money to pay soldiers' salaries, produce new tanks, and send ammunition to the front. The economic collapse on the home front will directly lead to military collapse in Ukraine. Putin's entire war strategy will be buried under the economic wreckage he created. The war will be lost not with missiles, but with an empty treasury. As can be seen, the most critical front in this war was never the muddy trenches of Bakhmut or the ruins of Avdiivka. That front was always in the balance sheets of Russian companies, the budget tables of the regions, and the empty wallets of ordinary citizens. And Russia has suffered a catastrophic and irreversible defeat on this invisible but most vital economic front. The myth of Russia, the impregnable fortress, is now gone. The financial engine of Putin's war machine was destroyed not by a missile from outside, but by an unstoppable decay spreading from within. Collapse is no longer a debatable possibility, it is a reality accelerating daily through an uncontrolled and unstoppable chain reaction. The countdown to total chaos has begun, and as the clock ticks, the lights in the Kremlin are going out one by one. If you found this video informative, don't forget to leave a like. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How do you think this economic collapse in the Kremlin and the tension among the elites will affect the fate of post-Putin Russia? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay informed about new videos. Your support is truly crucial for us to continue producing this kind of in-depth content. See you in the next video. Take care.